It's nice to, of course, see all of you. It's nice to see that you would come out to remember General John Forbes on the anniversary of his passing on March 11, 1759. Now, it was truly a pleasure as the Director of Education here. If you don't know me, my name's Matt. It's great. Love to meet you, all right? But it was really a pleasure to get to dive into focusing on John Forbes and his backstory specifically. And just to begin this talk, I'd be remiss if I did not give credit to the scholars who have put so much research and time into fleshing out Forbes, but also the campaign he was responsible for in this time period in general. I highly suggest their work, those being specifically who I drew upon, Dr. Michael McConnell, Dr. David Preston, John Oliphant, and Doug Cubison. Each one I've had the pleasure to meet, and their passion for the history truly makes these topics more accessible to all of us. So I thank them and the so many other historians and scholars who put a great deal of time, research, and effort to bring us these stories. So let's dive into tonight's topic, the man, General John Forbes, and let's remember him. Now, when focusing on the French and Indian War in textbooks, Forbes' name is often absent. So that kind of got me questioning, why is that? The people who we always remember, Washington and Braddock, they remain at the forefront of our minds. One suffers a horrible defeat in the failed conquest of what would later become Pittsburgh, and the other becomes the Revolutionary War general and first president of the United States. So again, I ask, why is Forbes forgotten? This is the same man who rose through the ranks of the Scots Greys, fought in the War of Austrian Succession, became a brigadier general, marched a massive army across the colony of Pennsylvania, and in the end, succeeded where General Braddock had failed. Now, I will say that Forbes is remembered in smaller ways, especially around western Pennsylvania. If anyone is familiar with Forbes Avenue? Yes, of course. Forbes Avenue, in turn, what was once Forbes Field, bare, and in the case of the field, bore his name. But even when we do notice the small street sign in Pittsburgh, Mount Washington is quite literally looming large over the city. General Forbes can't catch a break. Now, also when you folks came in tonight, you may have noticed the stained glass window that beckons everyone in as they join us in our Center for History Education. Whereas many people believe that is actually George Washington looking down on them, it is General Forbes watching over his fort, a testament to his greatest accomplishment and his impact on history. Tonight, I hope that we can elevate Forbes, the man and the general who made Pittsburgh and this fortification where we sit tonight possible. So, the best place to start, of course, is at the beginning, right? John was the youngest of several children of his father, also named John Forbes, and his mother, Elizabeth Graham. When young John Forbes came into this world on September 5th, 1707, in Edinburgh, it was 4 months after his father had left it. The family home was Pittencrieff in Dunfermline, and here is the house itself that you can actually, if you go there, you can still visit it today in Scotland. It is a good guess that when it comes to the education of John Forbes, he would have been either educated by private tutors or educated. There is a grammar school that was located very close by that he could have went to as well. But when it comes to the rest of the family, much of the information about the Forbes sisters has been lost in the pages of history, but we do have a more telling narrative about his brothers and the impact they had on his life. Especially as John will rise through the ranks of the military, he will be in contact with his brothers Arthur and Hugh. Now, those two brothers and Forbes himself had some financial issues, and we're going to see that throughout this evening. Arthur probably had the worst of the money problems and was quite the lavish spender, and that is not going to help anyone. Now, with Arthur having those issues, Hugh ends up, he ends up being a lawyer. So Arthur and Hugh just do not really get along with each other. And John actually has to act as this almost moderator in certain circumstances when he's dealing with his brothers. And there's even one instance of this comes from Forbes in 1740 as he writes to Hugh, Arthur has been here these 3 or 4 days. Pray right him, for he is certainly a kind-hearted fellow, and although he has his follies, one should endeavor to palate them. Now, John, who's not the firstborn son, is going to have to find a different way to navigate society. He's going to have to find a different way to make his way in the world, because Arthur is the one who inherited Pit and Creek. Again, lavishly spending. Probably, you can guess what's going to happen to this. Nothing good. But before John actually joins the ranks of the military, he ends up studying medicine at the University of Edinburgh. Some additional proof of this was in 1733, when he was a witness to his colonel's will. He was referred to as Dr. John Forbes. So he does have this medicinal background before becoming involved in the military. When he does, this is what's going to lead John into his own money issues. It's going to be most likely through borrowing money that he is able to, in 1729, become the surgeon of the very famous Scots Greys. Now, when I show this image up here, that has been in a lot of, specifically for historians and those who enjoy history, the Scots Greys, and this is at a later time period, but Scotland forever. That gives this impression of this heroic and very almost historically fabled unit, the Scots Greys. So he becomes a surgeon in the Scots Greys at the age of 22, and he finds a patron in Colonel James Campbell. This will begin a pattern, like I said, of borrowing money, and John Forbes is going to learn how he has to navigate the politics of military life through various connections. In 1735, he yet again borrows money and purchases a cornet's commission rather than returning to civilian life. Of course, as a surgeon and having that background, he probably could have been able to actually go back and maybe through his abilities with medicine would be able to spend the rest of his life that way, but chose instead to continue in the military. And John is going to not only establish friendships, but he gets a lot of these from these associations and clubs that some of these officers are affiliated with. Now, some of these clubs could be considered types of gentlemen's clubs, and the reason I do this is because if I was going to go into depth about those clubs, this program would need a disclaimer for 18 and older, so we're not going to do that. But when it comes to Forbes' role in those clubs, we know not definitively that he was a part of them, but we know the people he associated with most definitely were. One person who he's going to come into contact and cross paths with is going to be Lord Loudon, who we're going to see him come into play a little bit later on. But even with these relationships, Forbes is constantly worried about becoming stagnant in his position. In the military and his promotion, what's coming next? How is he going to be able to move up through the ranks? And also because his creditors are on his back constantly. So he's really worried about that. But when we come to focusing then on the Scots Greys, they're not seeing a ton of action at this point. There are times when they're called in to put down riots, but the big part of what the Greys are doing at this time, they're doing routine marches, and they're focusing on coastal duties. So they're not in a time of war yet. Note I say yet. Because the duties of the Scots Greys are going to change greatly when the succession of the throne in Austria is challenged after the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, leaving his crown to his daughter Maria Theresa, which for some caused questions as to if the crown was legally hers. And that was enough for Frederick II, who we know as Frederick the Great, of Prussia, to push his advantage, weasel his way in, and attack Silesia, leading us now to the War of Austrian Succession. France is going to join Prussia, and Britain is going to join on the side of the Habsburg Empire and Maria Theresa. Now, other European allies are going to join on the two sides, of course, and this is because of the threat of a shift in the balance of power. In Europe, as you have a balance of power and all those countries that are so close together, if any of them start to expand borders, we see it in history lead to warfare and conflict. Now, on April 23rd, 1742, Forbes borrows money again. You guys are going to be able to say this out as I go through the presentation. Borrows money, all right? And he's promoted to lieutenant when the position opens through another lieutenant's retirement. Now, I am going to go through and talk a little bit about the War of Austrian Secession. Now, when I do that and talking about battles, if I would go through and try and give you a very in-depth picture, we'd be here for the next 2 weeks. So I'm not going to do that, but instead I am going to talk about some of the battles where Forbes is greatly impacted. When he sees, when he learns from these battles, and they're going to play a role specifically where we're at tonight. So at the Battle of Dettingen, he was a part of a massive cavalry charge. You can actually see this image back here of George II. And George II led his troops in battle personally in that battle. It was the last time a reigning British monarch would personally lead troops in battle. I thought that was rather interesting, and Forbes witnessed that himself. In September of 1744, John Forbes became a captain, which means what? He's borrowing money and more debt, all right? This is a pretty common theme. And even before he actually gets this captaincy, one had come up before, and Forbes is, he's not just kind of drawing down and saying, I need to keep moving, I need to keep moving. He's very aware of his place. The idea of when a previous captaincy had come up, my lord being fickle is afraid to sell out, and I being poor am afraid to push for the purchase, however something will cast up, hoping that something down the line will work out in his favor. So he did get his captaincy, so good for John Forbes here. At the Battle of Fontenoy, he witnesses as a command structure fully breaks down. And because of this, it allows for the collapse of battle plans as the Duke of Cumberland really gets swept up into the battle and is unable to properly command his troops. And several of the other officers are unable to effectively carry out the plan of battle. Now, since Forbes is there, he's going to learn about how important a chain of command is and understanding how important also it is to be decisive. Now, also at the Battle of Fontenoy, Forbes is going to be he's going to be hit in an emotional way. And that's because he sees his patron, as you heard me mention earlier, James Campbell. He's wounded during the battle. A ball tears through Campbell's horse and effectively shatters his leg. And at that point, as he falls from his horse, Forbes hurries over to him, and a surgeon arrives, and rather than removing him to a field hospital, they actually amputate Campbell's leg right on the spot. After the battle, Forbes actually goes looking for his fallen patron. I can only imagine that at some point he's thinking he's never going to see Campbell again. And he actually finds him in a house, just barely alive, and stays with him throughout the night, and Campbell becomes worse and worse as the night goes on. And at about midnight, enemy troops break down the doors to the house and take Forbes prisoner and leave Campbell there. So again, this is another point. Forbes believes he's not going to see his friend again. Forbes is actually able to get his release the next day, and he returns to a hospital to find Campbell somehow still alive. And at this point, he is able to actually stay with him throughout the night. Forbes is at points probably sleeping on the floor next to him, but he remains with him till the end, and then when Campbell passes, he will see to his burial. And really, just to kind of express how this hit Forbes, he wrote to his brother Hugh, "But what I am now going to tell you must affect you, as I have lost the best friend, bravest soldier, and honest man yet ever breathed, by which I am most extremely miserable, and as I have these 16 years entirely attached myself to him, I now find myself not only out of my friend, but without any patron to take me by the hand." Forbes was part of this devastating defeat and learned those valuable lessons. Like I said, the fact that when command unravels in battle, how it's important for your other commanders also to realize the commander's intent, your general's intent, how you're supposed to act decisively on the battlefield. And also, he's emotionally torn apart by losing Campbell. Now, in 1745, many British units are actually pulled back to Britain to deal with the Jacobite rebellion. Forbes and the Greys did not go back, so Forbes was not at Culloden. A lot of people have kind of speculated that myth that Forbes was there, but the Greys did not return. Instead, he's going to continue his ascent, becoming deputy quartermaster general in Flanders in 1745. And in 1746, purchased the rank of major in the Greys. You don't have to say it. With the role of deputy quartermaster, General Forbes is needing to find supplies for the soldiers, and he needs to really figure out how to transport those supplies. This experience most certainly impacts his decision-making process in the future campaign in 1758. He would also find himself working closely with John Ligonier. Lovely portrait that you see behind me here and is in our private collection. And Sir John Ligonier is going to be in command because Cumberland is actually back dealing with the Jacobite rebellion. So he's working with Ligonier, and Ligonier is going to be crucial to this war effort. And of course, he's going to be crucial in 1758 as well. Now, I want to take a second really to talk about John Ligonier, because the portrait that you see behind me, when I first started working here at the fort, portrait's beautiful. The fort is named after Lord Ligonier. But I think it's important to note his ferociousness on the battlefield. He is literally riding at the head of some of these cavalry charges in heroic fashion. Now, when I first I had no idea about that, because he had never stepped foot in North America. When we talk about General Forbes and the campaign in 1758. But during the War of Austrian Succession, this guy is a bulldog. Even at the Battle of the Veldt, after the Duke of Cumberland has returned, so Ligonier now, as the Duke of Cumberland is in charge essentially, Ligonier is going to lead another daring cavalry charge, which Forbes was most likely in as well, that actually saved the Allied army. As the enemy was amassing on the flank and prepared to destroy Cumberland's army, Ligonier charges headlong and breaks up this enemy force, only to be told that he should retreat. And at this point, he sends Forbes galloping off to try and get the order reversed, which is successfully done. And then Ligonier leads another cavalry charge, this time with less troops, but it's going to be devastating for the Scots Greys. That about a third of the men are actually lost in this charge. And Ligonier himself was captured. Now, with the Battle of Fontenoy, and now here with the Battle of the Veldt, Cumberland is he's getting some serious heat for some of his decisions on the battlefield. And at this point, he probably doesn't want to heap too much praise on Ligonier for his actions. But Cumberland actually would say of Ligonier, Sir John Ligonier charged at the head of the British dragoons with that skill and the spirit he has shown on so many occasions. Which that's nice and all, Cumberland, but I think we could have done better with that quote. Forbes escapes that charge unscathed, and his time with Ligonier, of course, is going to pay off later. When peace finally does come in 1748, the European world is essentially going to be left unsatisfied. The countries involved are all still on edge, and within 10 years, war is going to break out again. For Forbes, he is still a major in the Scots Greys, and now he's probably leading into a major during peacetime. Even his return journey is completely miserable. A storm blows up, and the storm, while they're on the boat, it actually kills a lot of the horses, and they have to lift these bodies of the horses, put them into the ocean. It's a terrible experience for his way back. And also at the forefront of his mind, his financial struggles are back to haunt him. Especially when on the 29th of November, Forbes became Lieutenant Colonel of the Greys for debt. From about 1750 to 1755, Forbes sought opportunities to continue to rise through the ranks, but when they arose, they slipped by, or if that's from bad luck, or perhaps some of his patrons or those he has made connections with, either they're speaking up for him and it's just not working out, or there is a failure to speak up for him. But he kind of finds himself during that time period in a stagnant position. Now, as I said, from 50 to 55, we are very familiar with what happens in our own backyard in 1754. As a young Virginian literally sets the world on fire when shots at Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity bring the world back to the brink of war. In 1755, in 1755, Edward Braddock is tasked with leading an expedition to take Fort Duquesne, and the crucial point at the intersection of the three rivers from the French. And this is interesting because with this expedition now is ripe with opportunity for Forbes. Braddock is going to need a quartermaster. And Forbes realizes, hey, I got the experience, I'm the guy for the job, and applies to actually be Braddock's deputy quartermaster general. But another gentleman actually gets that job. Yeah, I heard someone chuckling in the front. And that is the mad sort of fool, John St. Clair. So if you are familiar with John St. Clair, he is actually the basis of our latest whiskey that we just put out, because our whiskey makes you a mad sort of fool. And John was quite the catch. Didn't really get along with too many people, and he just had one of those personalities. We all know that guy, all right? But as fate would have it, with John St. Clair getting the quartermaster job, this probably was a good thing for Forbes, because Braddock's army marches through the wilderness, and as victory seemed imminent, a force of the French and their native allies orchestrated a devastating attack that nearly enveloped Braddock's army. Even the man who had won the quartermaster job from Forbes was wounded during the fight when a musket ball tore through his lung, breaking a collarbone and shattering his shoulder blade, a wound that he would never get over. So Forbes literally dodged a bullet. Bad joke. As Braddock's army fell into chaos and collapsed, the general himself was mortally wounded, fell from his horse, and a young Virginian, Washington, rushed to aid his fallen chief. And what's interesting, when I looked at, of course, The Wounding of General Braddock by Robert Griffin, and I was doing this research of Forbes to be able to, I connected the two of these between James Campbell when his patron was struck and fell from his horse and Forbes rushes over, and Washington as well when his patron is struck and falls and is in battle, and there's these, it's a devastating effect on both of these gentlemen, both on Forbes and on Washington. Now, as the army of Braddock fell into disarray and retreated back, the forts were now still entirely in the hands of the French and their native allies. War was officially declared in 1756 as Britain declared war on France, and things went incredibly poorly for the first few years of this war for the British, and we know this as the 7 Years' War. Now, I do think it is important to come back to Hugh and Arthur. What were they doing during this time? How are they? They are still very much in Forbes' life because they are often writing him about who is going to pay the debts they have all incurred. Hugh had bought a house he simply could not pay for, and he was legally bound to pay interest on huge debts incurred by his brother. Even writing about Arthur, who it seems miserably spends the income of the whole estate, and even some debts that he had guaranteed for John. Now, Hugh was under the impression that even if he could pressure John Forbes enough, John would sell out. And then with this, hopefully if he sold his lieutenant colonelcy, it would save them all from financial ruin. Where that might be a temporary fix, it's not going to help them down the line. And Forbes simply would not settle for that. And on the 24th of 1757, of February, Forbes was made a colonel. This was what Forbes had been waiting for. Forbes, with this commission, the pay would be significantly increased, and this is what he believed could ease his mind of this financial misery. And whenever he became this colonel, you want to know who act as his guarantors, or the people who would be the ones to guarantee his loans? It was his brothers. So he ends up he's going to make his way to New York to participate in this conflict that had spread from the Ohio country throughout the colonies. and of course now, by this point, is around the rest of the globe. In 1757, through his connections and friendship developed with Lord Loudon, he was made adjutant general, and worked with Loudon in formulating how to combat the threat in North America. We also see Forbes' ailments really begin to show through during this time period. For those of you who are familiar with the Forbes story here, General Forbes is incredibly sick during this entire campaign. So this even traces back into 1757, where he writes to Loudon and he says, "My infirmities are really no joke. None are they to be played the fool, with both legs and thighs going one absolute sight, and the soles of my feet so blistered, so it was impossible for me to get abroad." Later he wrote, "Now lame of both legs and hands, and even observed, I am now a downright leper." So he is feeling a great deal of pain. This is a man who is sick, and also he's probably sick of his family. But due to the political fallout and various reasons, Loudon was actually recalled by William Pitt in March of 1758. So now as we kind of look at Forbes here and start to imagine him now, when we look at his portrait here, you don't see a sick man. And I like that we can see this portrait, and I'm sure the way he would want to be remembered as we think about this presentation, and kind of just think of Forbes as in a sense as a whole. So with William Pitt recalling Loudon in March of 1758, Forbes is actually the one who has to inform Lord Loudon, his friend. But when he tells him the news, he kind of leaves off the fact that he has been elevated to Brigadier General. So he also now has a promotion himself. Pitt's appointments included Jeffrey Amherst as Major General, James Wolfe, Abercrombie, who he's still around, but he takes Loudon's place, and Forbes himself. Now Pitt's plan is going to focus on a pronged attack, which focused on removing the French from New France, and Forbes was given the command to take the French Fort Duquesne. So now where General Braddock had once attempted and had failed, now Forbes is the one who's going to have to take this on. So with no time to spare, Forbes is going to have to act fast to make sure his campaign could be a successful one. It can also be argued that this is the most difficult mission. As the other commanders would be given great amounts of resources, Forbes was going to have to rely a great deal on the colonies. He would have to traverse a great deal of terrain without the use of waterways. The construction of a road was instrumental, and he would have to supply his troops every step of the way. The amount of wagons and animals needed for this expedition would be quite the undertaking. And on top of it all, he would have to deal with the man who would serve as his quartermaster. The mad sort of fool himself has returned to rear his ugly head, St. Clair, who is now here and will immediately see to the needs of the army. When Forbes does arrive in Philadelphia with Francis Halkett, who's going to be an aide to help him out, he finds next to nothing prepared. The regular troops, the 60th and the 77th Highlanders, are nowhere to be found. Provincial troops need time to gather, but there was a contingent of about 600 Cherokee warriors in Winchester. So Forbes has no official army, but now he realizes that he's going to have to do some relations with these native warriors. And Forbes actually writes, "I have been here these 6 days by myself alone, having no mortal but Halkett." You gotta notice in some of these quotes, Forbes really, even though Halkett's there trying to help him, he does not give him the best of praises. "No mortal but Halkett. In short necessity will turn me a Cherokee, and don't be surprised if I take Fort Duquesne at the head of them, and them only. For to this day I have no orders to command any troops, nor has any troops orders to receive my commands that I know of." So we're off to a good start. But it is important to acknowledge that with these Cherokee warriors, and Forbes does realize the importance of Native American affairs. The importance of providing them with what they needed was crucial to his effort in taking Fort Duquesne. The lack of native aid to Braddock had been an element of his failure. But even if even if he could get them to ally to his cause, or have the various tribes remain neutral, it could deprive the French of a core strength. The negotiations with various tribes would truly be one of the most important parts of the Forbes campaign. And Forbes, he realizes this and gets that ball rolling almost immediately. And as the army is gathering, it's a problem. Like I said, he still doesn't have much of an army. His office, when it comes to officers and aides, he's got Halkett, tried and true, thank goodness. Even so much that when he speaks of Halkett, he says, "I wish you could send me either a secretary or a clerk or anything, for I have not time to dine or sup for this terrible writing. For you know well that Major Halkett, although honest and willing, is rather slow." Like I said, he doesn't get the, but hey, he's there. We can depend on Halkett. Forbes is also going to meet with his second command in May, and they quickly began to develop the necessary relationship that would be vital to this campaign, Colonel Henry Bouquet. And he would act as one of Forbes' greatest assets, really ending up being the eyes and ears for him. One that as Forbes' ailments continued, it allowed Bouquet to function in the place of his ill leader, and he truly does understand that commander's intent. Even in a small dispute with St. Clair pops up a bunch, usually causing trouble. Where St. Clair attempted to challenge the chain of command, Forbes gives St. Clair kind of a stern talking to and informs him that Bouquet has his complete trust and Bouquet commands everywhere in his own absence. When June arrives, the army is still in a shaky position, but it's enough that we can get this campaign started, that we can get this campaign moving. What we're going to see here is going to have to take place moving across this colony of Pennsylvania. The Highlanders had finally arrived, and the Royal Artillery had as well. These guns that were going to be necessary for taking Fort Duquesne and quite literally blowing it out of the point. And I'm sure at this point Forbes was just thankful to be moving. His army would end up being closer to between 6,000 and 7,000 in total. When all was said and done, that ebbs and flows, of course. And Forbes' plan was to move east to the west, constructing a road and building fortifications over all that difficult terrain. Those fortifications he will construct end up being called Loudon, Littleton, the post at Raystown, and this is where we run into Forbes having to deal with some personnel issues. There's going to be a controversy as to if the road needs to move over Laurel Hill, or is it going to take the old Braddock Road. This also, the reason this whole controversy really comes up is because of various political and economical situations in the colonies of who would benefit from the road. If they're taking commerce through the road, who's going to end up, in a good financial position? Colonel George Washington believes that they should take the Braddock Road. He's going to hold that position pretty firm because that's also going to lead to commerce for Virginia. That's a good thing for Colonel Washington, and also because he has stake in the Ohio Company, a land speculation company. And really, his objections that he writes to Forbes completely become a thorn in Forbes' side. Even so much that at one point there's a rumor that starts being developed that native warriors will not join because they refuse to march on any other road. Sure. And Forbes is going to call the bluff on that one. And if anything, probably the bickering reinforces him to actually move over Laurel Hill. And after some proper reconnaissance and a little stubbornness, it was determined the road was most definitely possible and could be constructed. The further and further this army moved west, the further they got from civilization, and into territory where raids by the French and their native allies could be quite prevalent. These fortifications, though, allow Forbes to protect himself and his supply chain. He is completely and desperately worried about those supply chains, those supply lines that he is forming, because they're getting longer and longer. And again, many of those previous lessons that he actually learns during the War of Austrian Succession are going to come through here. And as this army, as it's moving along, it is going to become spread out more. because the construction continues, you have advanced parties moving through, moving supplies up, and an advanced party is going to move to a site that we are very familiar with, next to the Loyalhanna Stream, because that's where we're sitting at today. They begin construction here, and with the army moving, the commander of this entire ordeal is doing quite the opposite. He finds himself at the rear of the army, his legs failing him. He is quite literally not able to move. Now, when the army had arrived here in late summer, it's not only going to be Forbes, his legs failing him, it's going to be some of his military officers. One very specifically is going to fail him in September. And surprisingly, it's not St. Clair. Instead, it's going to be Major James Grant, who takes nearly 800 men to reconnoiter Fort Duquesne. He actually, instead of just going out for reconnaissance, he marches on the fort, and outside of it is soundly defeated, in almost something that you could compare to a smaller version of Braddock's defeat. This was a shock to Forbes, even when he learned it. When it gets to when he reads about it, and this is going to put some serious strain on his relationship between Colonel Bouquet. How could this have happened? Forbes is worried this could derail literally everything he's been working on. Not just the campaign, but also, and I mentioned earlier, those deliberations with the various native tribes. If they catch wind of a defeat, quite possibly that could cause those deliberations to go quite sour. And on top of it all, he is still in just terrible health. And I think he knows he's running out of time at this point. Even commenting at one point that he says he is feeble as a child. His army is wanting of supplies, and the intelligence on the French at the forks was truly minimal at best. On October 12th, 1758, the French at Fort Duquesne pushed their advantage and attacked the post at Loyalhanna. And even though they were repulsed, Forbes and Bouquet both are embarrassed and disheartened that the larger force that was here was actually pushed back into the fort, and both sides end up claiming a victory. More for the British, it's more of a moral victory, to try and keep morale literally up amongst the troops. And also, it is October. Forbes is feeling the pressure of the winter season coming on. Not only for the movement of the army itself, but the strain on his supply chain. Would he be able to provide for his army? Would he literally even survive to be able to provide for his army? In November, Forbes holds a council of war with his officers and decided to keep his troops at Loyalhanna for the winter. This choice must have been difficult for the former quartermaster, as his men were in dire need of provisions, and Forbes orders the quartermasters to begin issuing half rations. Directly after this council, on November 12th, another debacle occurred, as a group of Virginians mistook each other for the enemy in the woods and fired upon each other in a friendly fire incident. As we see here, George Washington being present at that friendly fire incident. But if there is a silver lining to this, it is the fact that there is a prisoner taken, a straggler, in the woods, and he has vital information on Fort Duquesne, the fact that it was incredibly weak. With receiving news not only there that Fort Duquesne is weak, but he also receives news of these deliberations, and they have gone well at Easton. And peace talks with these native tribes with the idea that they will essentially have a ceasefire against the British that will deprive the French of their allies. With all this new information, he acts decisively. He's not going to wait. On November 13th, he orders the army to hold themselves in readiness to march at an hour's warning. And they do. They move immediately. As his army had found itself on the verge of starvation and low morale, fortune had favored Forbes. On November 23rd, with the army on its way, the French knew that they would not be able to withstand this massive force, and the fall of Fort Duquesne was inevitable. They lit it ablaze and abandoned the post. Forbes, in the face of such adversity, had accomplished his goal. Here we see the point from a bird's eye view today. Fort Duquesne, the smaller there, and what will later be Fort Pitt. So he had accomplished his goal in the face of such adversity, and the forks of the Ohio were now in in British hands, and it was newly named Pittsburgh, or since Forbes was Scottish, Pittsburgh. I don't have a very good Scottish accent, so I'm not going to even try. And there was still much to do, but Forbes was nearly on death's doorstep. On the 26th, he was plagued by another inflammation of the stomach, midriff, and liver, the sharpest and most severe of all distempers. And noted that he would leave as soon as he was able to stand, but God knows when or if I ever should reach Philadelphia. He was carried back over the mountains along the road he had constructed and did return to Philadelphia alive. On February 13th, he made his will, which ended up being divided all that he had, which was not much. And it was between Arthur and Hugh. But one thing that he did have plenty of that he left was his debts. And those still needed to be sorted out. And that would take years. On March 11, 1759, Forbes left the pain and stresses of this world that he had dealt with for so long. And on the 14th, a huge military funeral was had in Philadelphia that saw military officers, soldiers, dignitaries, gun salutes, a horse with no rider, and much more to honor the fallen general, and saw Forbes buried in Christ Church. So when we think about Forbes' impact on our history, I think it really hits home when we sit here today. As we look at Fort Ligonier, and I just like to show his face quite often. And we think of General Forbes. When we sit out here outside of this fortification, and really what made the town of Ligonier possible? If there is no fort, there is no town of Ligonier. The decisions he made, the constructions of these various fortifications, not just Fort Ligonier, led to the establishment of Fort Pitt and truly what we know as Pittsburgh. The road he constructed led to further expansion west and in turn further conflicts with native tribes. The events in the last few months of 1758 truly made history, and they were building blocks that have led us to where we are at today. So I go back now to the beginning. Why is General Forbes usually forgotten? Whereas that could be due to his untimely death, and overshadowing by the campaigns further north in Pitt's plan, the repeated emphasis on Braddock's defeat, or even Washington's meteoric rise during the same time, I do know one thing, that tonight, General Forbes is not forgotten.